pale, brooding, forever miserable. Which makes sense if you've only met him through ravens, heartbreak, and Halloween decorations. But the real Poe laughed loudly. He danced. He picked fights with other writers in print, and he treated the literary world less like a temple and more like a contact sport. Yes, he wrote darkness, but he also imagined a universe on a scale that felt unhinged in his own time and visionary in ours. This episode isn't about a gloomy icon. It's about Poe as a sharp, funny, ambitious thinker, very much alive, and far stranger than the myth ever allowed. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am your host, Isaac S. Loftus, joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today, we have an interesting topic about a really interesting person.
Absolutely. Super excited to welcome Chris Semtner. He is the curator of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia. And he's also written some books about Poe, including Haunting Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's Afterlife in Richmond and Beyond. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
So first things first, how did you get into Poe? How did he become sort of the focus of what is now your career?
Well, it probably all started about fifth grade, and our intermediate school library was in a trailer, and as I recall, it's just one small room with a bunch of books, and our teacher made the mistake of letting us read Hop Frog and Never Bet the Devil Your Head, and all these comedies. Never Bet the Devil Your Head is actually a funny story up until the guy gets his head chopped off, and they say he came down with the case of the Transcendentals because Poe didn't like the Transcendentalists. And I thought that was funny. As like a little 10-year-old, you think that's really entertaining. And I thought Poe was a funny writer. So then Hop Frog was about a court jester who loves to play practical jokes. What could possibly go wrong? Well, of course, then he ends up setting the king on fire, and it's a real gory, gruesome mess. And that's the sort of thing that you really love at that age. So I start out primed to think of Poe as a funny writer. So when you do read things like The Telltale Heart and The Cask of Amontillado, you start to look for the hidden humor. Like The Cask of Amontillado has that great example where the murderer is taking his victim down to the catacombs and saying, "Oh, no, we must go back. It's damp down here." And then the victim starts coughing, and the murderer says, "Oh, your health is precious. We must return. You are man to be missed." And the victim says, "Oh, 'tis nothing. I shall not die of a cough." The murderer says, "True."
I don't know if I've ever heard someone saying that they became interested in Edgar Allan Poe because of how funny he was. This might be
yeah. Well,
but I didn't even know, just casually, as a casual fan of him, because I've enjoyed reading his stories over the years and when I was younger, I didn't even know that he wrote comedies. I wasn't even aware.
A lot of his output is comedies. He even wrote a romantic comedy that's 3 Sundays in a week. So he tried his hand at everything, and he started out trying to be a funny writer. It's just he wasn't that good at being funny, so the horror stories really took off and became more popular. So he just sort of slid the humorous references on in there. But during his lifetime, he was known as a really fierce literary critic and a commenter on the literary scene of his day. So he was known to smack talk the other writers, and that's the reason people tune in. They would buy Godey's Ladies book to read his Literati of New York City series, where he just listed each author and made fun of them. Even though Longfellow wasn't one of the New York writers, he still put him in there, said he was a quack fallible legion of literary quackery who has no original ideas, but does a fairly good job of stealing other people's ideas.
Hearing about like the nitty gritty of his career doesn't jive with the image of him as like sort of like a romantic writer, or even just like how the stereotype of that, like, oh, here's someone that's really pained and they're going to sit and sort of like toil away at their desk and produce this great art.
Yeah, he was a magazinist. He was right there in the middle of the magazine industry. And there were authors for years who had published these beautiful leather-bound volumes with gilded-edge pages. And Poe wasn't doing that. He was publishing for the penny press and for the $3 magazines. That's $3 for a year's subscription, as opposed to the $5 expensive magazines. He was publishing in what he called sometimes namby-pamby magazines that had the fashion plates and everything. He was writing for a mass audience. And after he published one of his stories, a horror story about a guy who's in love with his wife's teeth, even beyond death. And he almost got fired, but he told his boss, trust me, this is what's going to sell. We don't care what the critics say. We don't care what's in good taste. We're not trying to edify our readers. We're trying to sell magazines. And he knew how to sell magazines by really making an impact on his audience, whether that's being funny or being scary. Because you think about today, what are the great genres that really affect the emotions? Probably romance, where somebody dies at the end, it's all weepy. Poe did that with his poetry. I mean, he wrote lots of poems about beautiful young women dying, and he said the specific reason for that was because of the impact it made on his readers' emotions. It's something everybody knew back then, so he said, I'm going to write about that. But with his horror stories, he's in the magazines. He's reading the articles about premature burials and vicious murders, and he says, I'm going to write stories about that stuff. People are buying up the newspapers to read about the latest horrible murder in New York City. Why don't I write a story about a horrible double murder in Paris? And then with comedies, you really need an emotional reaction. You need a response. If you just write a comedy or have a comic film and nobody's laughing, you didn't do your job. But Poe knows how to really tap into what his audience wanted. In his time, they would have known of him for having his feuds with Longfellow. He called his little Longfellow war. He would trash talk Longfellow. And Longfellow's so popular, so famous, he doesn't even need to dignify this response. So somebody sent Poe an anonymous letter to his magazine accusing him of plagiarism. And some critics think that Poe sent himself that anonymous letter just to keep things going.
That's hilarious.
And, of course, the transcendentalists complained that Poe's stories didn't have a moral. And he says a story shouldn't have a moral. It should just entertain you. It just make you feel something. Have what he called a unified effect.
It sounds like he's very modern, first of all. I feel like he'd do well in like Hollywood today. He's his own best publicist.
Oh,
which
yeah.
is interesting.
They probably have a franchise of him. He'd have the Telltale Heart franchise with 10 sequels or something. Like they bury him on the floorboards in the first story, then they dig him up from the floorboards in the second, and put him back down the third installment. Maybe he'd even have a superhero franchise.
This all sounds very practical. I actually like the image of him as like a very, a pragmatic writer. Like, listen, I'm going to write what sells. Like,
and actually, he did kind of have a franchise with his Auguste Dupin mysteries. He created a detective called Auguste Dupin, and the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and the Purloin Letter, the Mystery of Roger. So he would come out with these different sequels to it, and maybe he would have done more if he hadn't died.
Well, and isn't that the case that he is the one who really invented the detective story? I know that Sherlock Holmes sort of gets the credit for being the first, fictional detective in detective stories, but I feel like Poe was first for that one. He did a lot of firsts, didn't he, in literary history? Yeah,
Dupin beat Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes by 46 years. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said there really wasn't much original to do after Poe, that he pretty much blazed the way for all else to follow, who developed the standard detective story plots and the plot devices. Just things like The Least Likely Suspect. That's a Poe thing, from Thou Art the Man. Or the villain who scatters false clues to frame somebody else for the crime. Or the impossible murder that's taken place inside of a locked room that's still locked from the inside when the police arrive, and they can't figure out, how could the murder have gotten past us? The door's still locked.
It's like a CSI episode, or
and you know how
Law and Order.
Law and Order always has that they brag they're ripped from the headlines. That's what Poe did. In The Mystery of Marie Roger, he based it on the real-life murder of Mary Rogers. He didn't even try to hide it. He wrote right at the beginning of the story that you're going to encounter some strange coincidences between this story and the recent murder of a cigar salesperson in New York. And the circumstances are pretty much the same, because he'd just taken the story complete, renamed all the characters and based his own story on it. And when the police in real life couldn't solve it, of course, Auguste Dupin came in and he offered his solution to it. You just had to read the magazine to find out what was happening. And it was printed in installments. So each month he had to add new details when new details showed up in the real life case.
It reminds me a little bit about that. There's a caveat at the beginning of Fargo, the movie, that it says like everything that you're saying is the names have changed, dates and names have been changed out of respect for the dead, but all the details have been left exact. Everything else is exactly the same out of respect for the for the living, or something along those lines. But yeah, it's amazing how you think that that's a modern contrivance, like that ripped from the headline stuff, but this is like over 150 years ago.
Yeah. What Poe's maybe what makes him modern was part of it was just he was trying to make a living from his writing. He wasn't a professor or a lawyer, didn't have a cushy customs house position like a lot of other authors at that time did, didn't have the family money. So he was really right there in the trenches trying to survive from his pen. And that meant cranking out new content and coming up with new ideas. And along the way, he came with a pretty modern concept. The poem should exist for the poem's sake, which in France, they started talking about the same time about art for art's sake, that art should just be beautiful art. It doesn't have to teach you anything. It doesn't have to have a message. It doesn't need to indoctrinate you or make you more patriotic or anything. It just has to be entertaining and exciting. And
listen, you could see like a modern version, like Blue Man Group or something like that. It's just entertainment for entertainment's sake. It's not. Yeah. There's no real there's no message here. It just is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I certainly love the spooky side of Poe. I feel like that's the one everyone knows and everyone thinks about.
Yeah.
And when I guess you have the difference between the murder mysteries, but then you also have the spooky, Telltale Heart, and just the ones that sort of bring you into this moment of pure terror. Was that because at the time he was writing, what was going on in, Richmond and the U.S. at that time? Were people just interested in spiritualism? Were they interested in ghosts? Sort of, what was he tapping into when he was writing those scary stories? Like The Raven, even.
Well, he understood the world around him, and this was a time when I call it the golden age of mourning. People really knew how to mourn. Like, if your husband dies, you're dressing all in black for the first year. You have a black veil on your face for the first 3 months or so. And you could mourn for years. Like Queen Victoria, she went on for mourning for 40 years after her husband died. Poe's mother-in-law did the same thing. For the rest of her life, she just dressed in mourning. And there were lots of customs about it, like carrying a little glass vial to catch your tears for the first year. And that way you could put a little stopper in it and keep all of your tears as a souvenir. And it'd be death mask and post-mortem portraits.
Oh, yeah.
And so Poe's in that era where it became really popular to write poems about, say, beautiful young women dying. There's entire books of mourning poetry. We have 3 of them here at the Poe Museum that you could just carry around and read with you. You want something encouraging. And they're from 1844 to 1845, which is right in the middle of Poe's career, right when he's really getting popular. And they're both edited by people that Poe knew, but Poe's not in any of these volumes that we have in our collection. And I thought, well, he definitely outdid everybody else on the death. Why isn't he mentioned? And then I realized when you read through all the poems, they got titles like The Dead Child, The Dying Child, The Dead Wife, The Dying Bride, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. They're all encouraging. They're supposed to be encouraging, telling you that you'll see your beloved in heaven, you'll be reunited, everything's going to be okay. Oh. And Poe's poems are about how we're just going to be worm food.
Exactly.
Like the play is the tragedy, man, its hero, the conqueror worm. Or even in The Raven, tell the soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aiden it shall clasp the sainted maiden who the angel named Lenore. Quoth the Raven, nevermore. You'll never clasp the radiant maiden ever again. No distant heaven will you ever see her again. It's just, that's the end. And people didn't want it to be the end. But
that's fair.
Also this time there were plagues and pandemics. Tuberculosis was very widespread. And it was really peaking about this time. We're before germ theory. So this is a time when a lot of people are moving to the cities in cramped quarters, and diseases like this are just spreading like wildfire. And in 1832, that's when you had the massive cholera pandemic that swept all the way from Asia across Europe and Africa to the Americas. And there were millions of people dying of cholera. And it's something the West, we just hadn't seen. People didn't know what to do. They thought the world was ending. And just like that, you might have everybody in a household wiped out. And people wanted to know there was something else. So at this time, you had the Second Great Awakening. You had people really looking for answers. And there was a visitor from France who came to the United States and wrote about how it seems like there's a new religion popping up every 2 weeks there in the United States. And there was a district up in New York where it seemed like there are all these religions just popping up. You know, the Millerites who thought the world was going to end, I think, in 1842. Then it didn't end. So they said, oh, we checked our math. It's going to end in 1843 instead. And then about this time, right in the middle of this, people had this idea, well, maybe we can somehow communicate with our lost loved ones, these ones that we just lost suddenly. This is still before the Civil War. Then the Civil War, it really took off the idea. You had your son, your husband go off to battle, and you never saw him again, had no idea what happened to him, and you really wanted some way to reach out and get in touch with him. And in Poe's day, there were mesmerists. And mesmerism had been a while. That it was at the time called animal magnetism. There's a fellow named Mesmer. They just sort of named it after him, but his idea was that all animate and inanimate objects had magnetic forces running through them, and you could control those forces. So if you use animal magnetism on your chicken, you can make it lay more eggs, or you can make your cow produce more milk, or you could control a person. And they were trying experiments.
Okay.
One was a surgeon, and he would put people in a mesmeric trance and perform surgeries on them. And one of the theories about which Poe himself believed, he wrote about in one of his letters, was that when you're in a mesmeric trance, your soul is freed from your physical body. And what does that mean? If your soul is separate from your body, it's not restricted by your physical senses, your physical eyes and ears, and you can see spirits. And Swedenborg, a century earlier, talked about seeing spirits, and Swedenborgianism was getting popular in the United States again at this time. But mesmerists were starting to go even on stage. There was a fellow named Andrew Jackson Davis who would go on stage in New York. They called him the Poughkeepsie Seer. He was from Poughkeepsie. And while he was on stage, he'd go into a trance, and he had someone there, sort of like a secretary, to write down whatever he dictated. He would say, this is what I can see from the other side. So it's kind of like an Edgar Cayce thing. Edgar Cayce is more of a 20th century version of this. And he said he could see another world called Summerland, where spirits of all different religions and races went, and they lived together as eternal summer. So he got really popular. People would pay money to see him perform. But about the same time he started performing, there was an article that came out in the American Review, a popular magazine up in New York City. And it was about this fellow named Valdemar, who he was dying and he was wasting away, and he sort of donated his body to science. He gave these doctors permission to mesmerize him, to see what happened. And they put him in a mesmeric trance. And he stayed in this trance state for months. Even after it was apparent he was dead, his body was decaying, his tongue was a big black mass, and he would even say, I am dead. And so they said, well, let's ask him what's like on the other side. What do you see over there? And so for 7 months he was in his mesmeric trance, and finally he just said, I am dead, wake me, I'm dead. So break me out of this trance so I can just die already. And they woke him up from his trance, and he just dissolved into a pool of goo before their very eyes. The account says it was a loathsome, detestable, massive putrescence.
Nice.
And this story caught on, and it was being reprinted on both sides of the Atlantic. There's there's a booklet in England that said this story has to be true because everybody in America believes it. It was reprinted in the Popular Record of Modern Science. Medical
Oh
journals
my
were
gosh.
reprinting it. And it didn't take long to connect the dots that you couldn't trust its author one bit because its author was Edgar Allan Poe. And he will
He liked to
start
mess with
attacking in
people.
his magazines, but Poe refuted in one of his magazines. He says, "This is no more bizarre than anything the transcendentalists believe."
Oh.
So
went on
another
a-
smackdown at the transcendentalist, but
Oh my gosh.
I think I went on a week-long camping trip one time when I was in grade school, and I think at the end of that, I could be described as a loathsome mass of putrescence also.
oh yeah,
Because-
we used to have cologne in our gift shop called Detestable Putrescence. We thought it was great, but it just didn't sell. I guess nobody wanted to smell like
I wonder
rotten
why.
corpse.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah, troll people.
if you don't want to talk to if you don't want someone talking to you when you're sitting on the bus or on the train, like this is what you got to do.
Yeah.
So he was poking fun at the transcendentalists and stuff. So what did Poe actually believe? Was he a spiritual? Because even you mentioned like his comparison to Arthur Conan Doyle later, he was like ended up being like a pretty crazy wacko spiritualist. Was Poe on board with this kind of stuff, or was he just all sort of ribbing at these folk and playing with their tropes?
Poe seems to think it was funny. And
Okay.
he met Andrew Jackson Davis, and Davis was impressed by him and said that Poe had a little spirit that followed him around wherever he went. And he corresponded with another Swedenborgian and mesmerist named George Bush, not the president's George Bush, different George Bush. And Bush apparently told him everything that's in your stories is absolutely true. And this just tickled Poe. He thought, well, yeah, I'm really getting one over on him. And Poe wrote about this time that he said that spirituality to him was just a word. It didn't mean anything. And then the same letter he writes about how you can see spirits if you're in a mesmeric trance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he was trying to have it both ways. Towards the end of his life, a year before his death, he wrote a book called Eureka, his Theory of Everything book. And that one he explains where the universe came from, where it's going to go. He had this idea that, there was different theories about why the universe, one of them was, God created everything and just sort of came into existence. Another was there's just sort of a big cloud and forms condensed from the cloud. Poe's idea was that there was a very, very dense particle and there's a big bang and the whole universe irradiated from that single particle in all directions. And then eventually it would expand so far that it would contract back in on itself to the initial particle. And he said, well, there's a problem here because he said that if the particles are all one, there's no force of attraction or repulsion between the individual particles. So there's no energy. So he said if there's no energy, then there's no matter. There's no matter, there's no space. If there's no space, there's no time. So he said that when it crunch back into itself, it would just cease to exist. So it must have started from not existing. So he said, well, where must it come from? Another universe. So he has this cycle. He says that the universe pops into existence, then crunches back on itself, and then another universe pops back into existence from like that other dimension. So there's a series of universes. And in the book, he even says at the end that as children, we can remember our previous lives in those other universes. But the adults tell us that, oh, those are just dreams. That isn't real. So eventually we suppress that and we forget about those memories of our previous lives. And
Wow.
that's where Poe was at the end of his life. Some people think that he might have actually rejoined the church at the end of his life. As growing up, he would have gone to Monumental Episcopal Church in Richmond. So he would have had a firm foundation in Christianity. But we also know that he read an English version of the Quran because he references it in a lot of his early poetry, like Israfel, for instance, and Tamerlane makes reference to it. So, and even Al-Araf, his longest poem, references the Quran. So he's a searcher. And apparently his search brought him at the end to Eureka, this idea of multiple universes and multiple lives.
Now, how do you know that Eureka isn't another one of his, just for fun kind of
We don't
Trying to
know
pull one
that.
over on us.
endeavors. Yeah, how do you know when someone who's jokes all the time isn't
Yeah,
Yeah,
true?
it's
it's
being
hard to
serious.
tell. Best we got one of his letters he wrote to his mother-in-law about a year later that I don't want to live. I couldn't possibly accomplish anything else since I've written Eureka. So to her, he seems like he's sincere with it. But when he's trying to get it published, he wanted 50,000 copies printed. He wanted this thing to be read by everyone. And people who heard him read passages from it said that they didn't know what he was talking about. They were spellbound, but they didn't know where he was going with this thing. And for long stretches of the book, all he's talking about is patterns moving out from patterns of irradiation from a single source and the movement of light through the universe. And he talks about Olber's paradox, why the sky's dark at night. If there's all these infinite stars out there, why isn't it just light? And even said, well, that's because some of the stars are so far away, the light hasn't reached us yet. So he describes chaos theory and black holes. And then right at the beginning of it all, he has this goofy little story about a fellow from the year 2848, the distant future, flying across the ocean, and he says they're all communicating by floating telegraph wires, and he's writing a letter to the past and about how ridiculous people in the 19th century were, that they thought there were only two paths to knowledge. There's inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And he says he missed the point. He says you also need to have imagination and intuition. You need to follow those. And when Albert Einstein read Eureka, he didn't like a whole lot of it, but he did like that story at the beginning with the little guy from the future talking about how goofy people in the past are. And it even had a really bad Poe pun in it.
Oh, in the book?
Yeah, bad Poe pun where Poe says, the character is saying that all these people in the past, they keep talking about some ram and some hog. Who's the ram and the hog? There's this guy called Aries Tottle, and there's a fellow named Bacon. So yeah, sometimes Poe's humor is a little bit cringy. Maybe he invented the dad joke.
Yeah.
Another thing that he's responsible for inventing, the dad joke.
Yeah, not gonna lie, going into this conversation, I had a preconceived notion about Poe, and I don't know if he would have been a fun hang. But based on what you're talking about him, I think he would be a fun dude to hang out with.
Yeah, people loved him. They said he was an excellent dancer. There's a description of him. He's hanging at one of his friends' houses, and everybody's gathered around. They're playing the piano. And then all of a sudden, he just bounds into the room, and he starts dancing a fandango around the room. He goes up on tiptoe and spinning around. So really enthusiastic dancer.
I'm interested, and this is just from your perspective, having worked with Poe for so long. What do you think he would think of his current perception, his current legacy of basically being goth and scary and for Halloween? Do you think that he would think it's funny that they sort of bought that part of him, or do you think he'd be absolutely incensed that most Americans have forgotten everything else about him?
Well, he probably would have been confused. He thought, well, everybody else has bought into Eureka. Why aren't they buying into Eureka? They believe in the Big Bang Theory now, so why don't they appreciate Eureka as a precursor to that? And, they believe in chaos theory and stuff like that. And, hey, I did that back in 1848. I beat out everybody else to the punch. I solved Olber's paradox, but then they just know me for the scary stories.
Yeah.
But Poe appreciated his horror stories. And a lot of critics, even today, don't fully appreciate the horror genre, don't really understand it, but Poe appreciated it. And in his first book of short stories, in the introduction, he says that don't confuse this work with those Gothic romances you've been reading, like Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto or Anne Radcliffe. This is something different. He called those pseudo-horror. He says that terror is not something of the Gothic or of Germany. It's of the soul. It's essential to our human experience. And if I've explored my stories, I've only done it with its legitimate causes and brought to legitimate ends. And he really thought he was doing something. He considered probably his best story to be Ligeia, which is one of his horror stories.
Mm-hmm.
He was a little bit disappointed when in his second book of short stories, the editors mostly just picked out detective stories. He said, well, they have the air of intelligence to them. They're a nice little parlor trick. But Ligeia, that's where it's at.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about that story for the listeners who haven't read it?
Oh, yeah. Ligeia is about a woman named Ligeia. And she's tall and dark and mysterious with large, dark eyes, long black hair. And the narrator, her husband, is so in love with her, but he just can't remember anything about where she came from or how they met. He's just so entranced by her. He's under her spell. And then she gets sick and she's dying. And she fervently believes from everything she's read of different Eastern esoteric works that we do not succumb to death alone, but for weakness of our will. So she's convinced that she can, through our own willpower, overcome death. And then she is on her deathbed, and a lot of novels back then had these deathbed scenes where somebody's dying, and people sing them hymns. They read them, encouraging poetry. But Ligeia on her deathbed says, why don't you read this poem I wrote? And her husband reads her The Conqueror Worm.
Oh.
To remind her that she's nothing but a worm, food, and then she wastes away and she dies. And her husband eventually meets the exact opposite woman. She's plump, she's blonde, she's the Lady Rowena. And then Rowena eventually gets sick. And the narrator doesn't care that much because he's still pining away over Ligeia.
Mm-hmm.
So he wraps up Rowena in her shroud and he waits by her body all night. But he starts to sense the room is moving around her. The patterns of the wallpaper are coming alive. And he senses that the body in the shroud is starting to breathe. And eventually he looks up to find it standing right in front of him. And from out the bandages, these long, dark tresses fall, and he realizes it's Ligeia, the Lady Ligeia, returned from the dead. So she's taken over the body and soul of Rowena. And this was from a series of Poe's early stories about similar women who find ways to come back from the dead. Berenice, she's actually buried alive, so she comes back from the dead because her husband rips out her teeth. He digs her up and rips out her teeth because he loves her teeth.
Of course.
And it wakes her up. And then there's Morella, and that one, a woman, she's dying in childbirth, and she threatens to come back and possess her own daughter. And then there's another one, Eleonora, which is next up on there after Ligeia, where a woman is able to come back as a spirit to watch over her husband. She just tells him, please don't ever remarry after I'm gone. Always stay true to me. So you know what he does.
Of course, he goes and remarries.
But Poe, even from these early stories, and this is early, he's in his 20s when he wrote Berenice and Morella. He's about 26 years old. So he's already exploring this idea of what is the boundary between life and death. He's already seen so many people he loved pass away on him. His mother died when he was 2 years old. He probably would have been in the room there. He was just a little kid, and she succumbed to tuberculosis. His brother died when at the age of 24, and Poe was living with him up in Baltimore at the time, would have watched him wasting away. His foster mother, his first great love, all these people he'd been close to were wasting away and dying. And can you hold on to these people somehow? What is that boundary between life and death? And he did a couple more stories. The conversation that's about spirits in the afterlife. There's the colloquy and the conversation. They're both about spirits in the afterlife who are communicating. They read like little dialogues where they're talking about what it's like on the other side, how the world ended, how you died. And the colloquy is actually a pretty interesting one because one of the characters describes what it's like after you're dead to gradually go from being a being to being part of the place around you, to just you're dissolving into the greater scheme of the universe. And that brings us all the way forward to Eureka, where he talks about how when everything is one, we're all one. We're all part of the same universe. We're all just one body. And then he says the blasphemous thing. He says, we're all God.
Oh.
So yeah,
And
the
that was
woman
his
he was seeing when
misstep.
Eureka came out, her pastor told her, cut off all contact with him immediately to save your soul. This guy's bad news for your soul. But he was trying to come to terms with what really does happen to us. And for him, he said this was kind of comforting to think that it's not just that our individual consciousnesses will cease to exist, will actually become combined with this universal conscience or consciousness. So we're all the mind of God. And so to him, God was a poet and the universe was a poem.
That's actually a really beautiful theory. And it seems like, we started out with mourning was almost, I don't know, in fashion, I guess. The more you mourned, the more you loved the person you lost, or it seemed like it was very much for show. And it seems like instead of falling into that, he worked it out through his art, which is these poems and these stories that he's writing. Did he try to be fashionable? Did he try to, keep up with the Joneses, if you will?
Well, mourning was different if you're a guy. I mean, if your wife dies, you wear the black armband for 6 months or so, then you're good to go. Because you got to hurry up and remarry so somebody can take care of the kids. So he probably dressed in, well, he always dressed in black anyway, but he probably wore the black armband or wore a black band on his hat for maybe 6 months after his wife died. But then you see him in a photograph taken, she died the end of January, and the photograph was taken that summer, and he's already in his nice fancy white vest and everything. So he's
no jar of tears.
Yeah, so he's done with that. And he still did mourn her in his poetry. There's a little couplet he wrote on the back of a manuscript for his poem Eulogy. And Eulogy is about the joys of married life, how his wife saved him from a life of despair. I dwelt alone in a world of moan, and my soul was a stagnant tide until the fair-haired young Eulogy became my blushing bride. And then on the back, it's these two little lines: deep in earth my love is lying, and I must weep alone. And he probably would have observed the typical mourning rituals of the time, like covering up your mirrors in case the spirit would see itself reflected, and probably cover up portraits of her. They did have a post-mortem portrait made of her. And if you Google portraits of Virginia Poe, it's probably the one that everybody's seen. It's the one where her head sort of slumped to the side, and it's because she's on her deathbed. She's dead, and the artist came in and is sketching her right there on her pillow, but sort of didn't draw on the pillow, just did a black background instead. So he probably would have observed these customary rituals. His mother-in-law was already dressed in mourning, so she continued to wear her mourning cap, and people describe her as always wearing the mourning cap. And then Poe wouldn't last much longer after that. He died not quite 2 years, a little over 2 years later. He died in October of 1849, and she died in January of 1847.
And he was only 40 when he died?
Yeah,
Is
just
that right?
40.
40 years old. He did a lot in those 40 years.
Yeah, he published his first book when he's 18. No reason to wait, just do it. He dropped out of college, published his first book because he was convinced that he'd do something great. He wrote to an editor. That's one thing, he promoted himself early on. Nobody knew who this guy was, so he just sent samples of his poetry to different magazines and introduced himself and says, I've got a new book coming out. It's called Tamerlane. You got to check it out, and here's some excerpts. And now nobody read that book, so I got a book coming out called Alaraf. You got to read that. Here's some excerpts. And eventually a guy called John Neal, way up in Massachusetts, read it and said that, this is nonsense, but it's exquisite nonsense, and we can expect far greater things from this poet in the future. And Poe said those are the first words of encouragement he'd ever received.
Oh.
Well, he plugged away for a long time before getting any encouragement.
Yeah, and he wrote to John Neal and said, I'm 20 years old here, but I know I'm a poet because no one who worships beauty the way I do could not be a poet. And I'd give the world to embody just half the ideas afloat in my imagination. So he's already convinced that he's got great ideas that he just needs to get on paper and share them with the world. And up until then, his first book, they only printed 50 copies. They weren't distributed. When his letters he'd send to editors did get noticed, sometimes they got ridiculed. There's an author named N.P. Willis who writes describing how he's got these sickening little verses about dreamland from this Edgar Poe, and the things he most enjoys about them is seeing them burn up in his fire. So it was kind of harsh before he finally found somebody who was willing to cut him some slack and say, you know what? You got potential.
Well, and his parents were actors, correct? And they died. They weren't. Well, his mother died, and his dad wasn't around. I think when did David Poe die? His dad, was that when he was young?
His father probably died right about 1810.
Okay, so about when he was a year old. So he lost his parents, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, but his father-in-law, which is where the Allan comes from, continued to say to Poe, do something respectable that will make you money. You can't be an artist. Being an artist will get you no money. And that's one of the reasons they had a falling out, and why Poe didn't have any words of support and had to struggle so much for money, correct? Because that's why he didn't have any, positive feedback other than this stranger up in New England.
Wait, Lynn, you said father-in-law. Is it stepfather or father-in-law?
I meant stepfather.
Stepfather, okay.
Let me
I was
say
going
that
to say,
again.
how progressive of him for taking his wife's last name as his middle name. Yeah.
Okay, so his adoptive father.
Gotcha.
Poe just couldn't catch a break early on. His parents were creatives. They were both actors, but his father just seems to have disappeared. There's a David Poe in a debtor's prison in New York in 1810, so that's probably the same one, but we don't know what happened to him after that, so he probably died shortly after that. Could have been anything. Could have been yellow fever, could have been tuberculosis. He's probably buried in some potter's field somewhere. His mother, she continued to tour, continued to perform, and still got covered in the newspapers, and made as far as Richmond, Virginia, where she gave her last performances before she succumbed to tuberculosis. And then Edgar, his brother and sister, all got split up and sent to live with different families. His sister went to live with the Mackenzie family in Richmond, and they were pretty well off. They ran a maritime insurance business, owned a lot of real estate in downtown Richmond, and ran a girls' school. And people describe the Mackenzie household as being full of creativity. They encouraged women to be creative, which wasn't always the case back then. A lot of times they thought that if women were too creative or too intellectual, they might go mad. And this was an era when actually women were hosting a lot of the big literary salons. And there's actually a woman who helped Poe really get noticed as Sarah J. Hale, who got Poe published in her magazine. She was the first woman to edit a national magazine. She published Poe's story, The Assignation. So his first story published in a national magazine because of Sarah Hale, who you probably know Sarah Hale because she wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. And also
really?
She's the one who wrote to Abraham Lincoln and said, we need a national day of Thanksgiving. So
I was going to say she's the Thanksgiving lady, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what in my head. I was like, Sarah Hill. I was like, I feel like she's the Thanksgiving lady.
Thanksgiving lady.
So Poe used to hang out at his sister's house all the time. He would play with his sister's brothers and spend time there. But the Allan home, they didn't really encourage that sort of thing. Mr. Allan was a tobacco exporter. He was a businessman. He considered him a self-made man. He'd come to the States from Scotland with nothing and made himself a tobacco empire. And basically he sold American products, tobacco and flour in England. Then he bought up European and Asian goods and resold them back in the States. And eventually he wasn't that good at business. The business went under. But he got bailed out by a rich uncle. So that's sort of John Allan's good luck, that he had a rich uncle who could bail him out. And eventually when the rich uncle died, he left Allan a fortune. But Poe didn't get that. But Poe himself
So-
was self-made because he left the Allen house with nothing, was left out of Mr. Allen's will. Even illegitimate children got on the will, but not Poe. But Poe decided, if I can just give birth to half these ideas I have in my head, I'm going to make myself famous. I'm going to really accomplish something. It's just, I have to figure out the international copyright law first. And Poe and Dickens used to talk about, well, how do we get a copyright law that's going to be international? Because Dickens was huge in the United States, but he wasn't getting paid for any of the reprints here. As soon as copies of his works got off the ship, that all these pirate publishers would just reprint it without paying him anything. Mm-hmm. So Dickens came to the States in 1842 to give a lecture tour. He went on the lecture circuit to make some extra money off these Americans, and met Poe while he was here, by the way. So that's how they got to know each other. And Poe's works were being reprinted over in Europe without him getting paid for it. But even in the States, if somebody made a play based on your story, there's no copyright protection for that. If they translated your story, there's no copyright protection for that.
Jeez.
And you could copyright a book, but you couldn't copyright an individual poem, which meant The Raven wasn't copyrighted. So every newspaper was reprinting it without paying Poe. So kids are following Poe down the street saying, nevermore, nevermore. He'd flap his arms like a big raven. But that's about what he got for it. But then Poe took a cue from old Dickens, and he said, well, why don't I go on the lecture circuit? And he made a lot more by reading the poetry than by publishing it. So you can make $15 for The Raven based on how much space it took up in the magazine. But you can make $100 in a single night just by performing it on stage.
Right.
So he took his show on the road. And fortunately with him, his poetry was designed to be heard. And when you read his poetry, just read it out loud to yourself. And you really get the full effect, especially the bells. That's one where it doesn't make any sense. If you just read the poem, it just says bells, 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 bells. But if you read it out loud, then you get the tintinnabulation that so musically wells from the bells, 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 from the rhyming and the chiming of the bells.
Sounds like something my 2.5-year-old son would like.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there you go. Start reading in Poe.
You should read him the bells and make him count the number of times it says bells in there. Like dozens and dozens of repetitions of the word bells. It's supposed to sound like the ringing of bells. It's sort of like onomatopoeia.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Oh, that's neat. So after he died, did his reputation at the time, was it, like, is our perception of him and his reputation now different than it was when he died? Or was it sort of like was like sort of a spooky spiritual, like people were latching onto the horror stuff then? Or has it changed? Or is that a more of a modern thing?
They thought he was a genius, but they also condemned him because they thought he drank too much. And that was a moral failing. And it's not the idea that, maybe you can become addicted to alcohol. That could be a disease or something. It's just the idea was, no, that's a moral weakness. You shouldn't drink too much. So people who condemned him usually condemned him on moralistic grounds, and they considered him brilliant but erratic. And some said, he had these moral failings because he was too much of a genius. And the spiritualists still did latch onto him. I mentioned that Andrew Jackson Davis met Poe, and later he wrote about meeting Poe and sort of said, he didn't really believe this stuff, but he secretly was a spiritualist. He's like a closet spiritualist, so we'll claim him anyway. And right before Poe died, that's when spiritualism really took off. Because Davis was on stage in March of 1848, and then he says, I have a revelation that somewhere right now, something earth-shattering has just happened, and the whole world is never going to be the same again. And he said this at the time that these little girls, the Fox sisters, up in Hinesville, New York, started hearing knocking sounds. It's little knocking sounds. And they would say, well, is that a ghost talking to me? And if so, knock once for yes, twice for no. And they would hear the knocks answer it. And they're just little girls at this time. They're just kids. But the adults were mesmerized by this. And they say, well, they must be tapping their toes. They'd hold their knees down to keep them from tapping their toes. Oh, that wasn't. Make sure they're not tapping with their hands. And they couldn't figure out how it happened. So all of a sudden, adults were going to visit them and having them communicate with spirits. And before long, Horace Greeley over the New York Tribune, who was a good friend of Poe's worst enemy, Rufus Griswold, they brought the Fox sisters to New York, and Horace Greeley put them up at his house, and then they had a reading at Rufus Griswold's house. And Rufus Griswold couldn't stand Poe, but he wrote a obituary of Poe that said, Edgar Poe is dead. While this news may startle many, few will be grieved by it. He had few or no friends, and just said what an awful person Poe was. And he published this obituary anonymously, so nobody would figure out it was him, but they immediately knew, oh yeah, Griswold totally wrote that. But Griswold doubled down, and he wrote a biography that said Poe is a madman, drunkard, womanizing, opium addict, a horrible, evil, wicked scoundrel, a liar, and a cheat. You should never read his works again, but had the opposite effect. His works sold out within 6 months, and they've continued to reprint editions of it over and over again. And today Griswold's just known for writing the first biography of Poe, but he just couldn't stand the guy. So Griswold had these people, had the Fox sisters, had the leading literati of New York City over at his house. Poe had just died. Poe's friend Francis Osgood had just died. Griswold was still editing the last 2 volumes of the works of the late Edgar Allan Poe. And while they were there, let's see, Cooper was there. James Fenimore Cooper was there, and N.P. Willis, the magazinist, was there. So anybody who's any in the New York literati scene was there. And they tried to contact spirits. And apparently it didn't work. They said that mostly because these were literati types, their accounts appeared in the newspapers the next day and the next week. They said mostly just sat in the dark listening for stuff. Occasionally they'd hear knocks, but they didn't make any sense. And there's one story that James Fenimore Cooper asked the spirits, is the person I'm trying to contact a male or a female? And it knocked that it was a female. And then, okay, did they die by falling out of window, getting struck by lightning, or falling off a horse and knocked the right number of times by falling off a horse? And then they said, oh, how many years ago did she die? And it just kept knocking. And they said, wait, slow down. We can't keep up with all your knocks. So it had to start over and start knocking all over again. They counted the right number of years. And it turns out that completely matched when Cooper's sister died. So if that's true, that's kind of spooky.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, all the men there started searching. The Fox sisters were sitting on a couch. They looked underneath the couch. They searched the whole room to see if they had an accomplice, and they couldn't figure out how they'd done it. And then more copycat spiritualists came along. Well, after the Fox sisters, they were what you call a medium. So you think of the medium of communication. So in those days, it might be a telegraph. That's your medium of communication between this place and this place. So the spiritualist medium is this, usually a woman who's helping you communicate with this spirit on the other side. You're communicating
so like a translator.
Through her.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were young girls. But as I mentioned, a lot of them were women. And adults were really taking them seriously. And this was a time when women didn't have a lot of rights. In most states, if you remarried after your husband's death, your new husband got all your stuff.
Right.
A lot of them couldn't sign legal documents. But here, they had people listening to them. So they would say, the spirits tell me you should abolish slavery. And adults were listening to them. The spirits tell me that women should have the right to vote. And, well, a long time later, women eventually got the right to vote.
Eventually.
But this gave women power that they hadn't had before. When they still couldn't vote, but they could influence people as spiritualist medium, because what you do, call the ghost a liar?
Right.
You gotta take it seriously.
I mean, didn't like Reagan have an astrologist or something like that in the White House?
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's what they say. They say his wife believed in astrology.
Yeah. It continues on. It's amazing how similar that whole thing is, because I'm familiar with this is another Arthur Conan Doyle reference, but the Cottingley fairies. I don't know if you're familiar with these 2 girls from England got a hold of their father's camera and were taking double exposures of fairies in the woods.
Yeah, it's the same thing. They thought they're just
people
little
started showing
kids.
up.
How could they trick these adults? And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of all people, bought this thing hook, line, and sinkers. They're such trustworthy girls. And if you look at the pictures, it's so obviously little paper cutouts, but
right, that look exactly like the fairies from their books that they were reading at the time.
And Arthur Conan Doyle was also a big spiritualist.
Yeah.
So spiritualism, like it really started to grow after Poe's death, and that seance they had at Griswold's house, they weren't able to get in touch with Poe. But it wasn't long at all. It was within that same year that a woman named Sarah Helen Whitman said she started hearing Poe knocking on the back of her chair. So what happens when you hear Poe knocking on the back of your chair? You hire a spiritualist medium, and a medium moved into her house with her for 6 months and helped her communicate with Poe's death before eventually she became a medium herself and didn't need to hire somebody else to do it for you. And
realized how much he was paying this person.
Lizzie Doden was just one of many mediums who would write down messages. They did spirit writing. And basically you just sit there in the dark and you just write down whatever the spirit guides you to write. And she wrote entire poems that she said that Poe dictated to her from the other side. And she wasn't the only one. Multiple mediums were reprinting Poe's poetry written after he died. They didn't share any of the money with his mother-in-law. That was kind of mean of them. They just sort of kept it all for themselves. But that was another popular thing. And eventually people said, you're just writing that yourself, right? So that's when they came with the Blanchette, where there's like a little pin attached to a little triangle, and you try to move it around with your fingers.
Ah, yes.
And eventually they'd use that for a parlor game called the Ouija board, which just means... Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. Ouija. And
that's funny.
By the 20th century, people were really taking Ouija boards seriously. And one woman claimed she was writing entire novels with her Ouija board. The ghost would tell her how to write. But can you imagine that? Writing it one letter at a time?
That would take forever.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That'd take you like a century to write just one short novel.
Yeah, that's impressive. Whether or not a ghost is telling you what to write, that's impressive in and of itself.
But spiritualism had its peaks in popularity. The Civil War was huge. World War I was huge.
Right. It makes sense with all this loss, with a lot of people. Yeah.
And then after World War I, you had Sir Arthur Conan Doyle traveling all around the world, preaching about spiritualism. This is your solution to everything. But at the same time, you had Harry Houdini, who early in his career had been a sham medium. He knew the tricks of the trade. Like one of them was you would have two men, the Davenport brothers, would get in a big box. You put a curtain over the front, and while they're inside the box, they're all tied up right, but suddenly you hear musical instruments playing from inside. Then when they open the box, they're still tied up. It must be ghosts. And Houdini was like, they just untied themselves. Here's how you do it. And then they put themselves back in the ropes afterwards. Easy. I'm Houdini. I can do this stuff. And Houdini really wanted to find a way to get in touch with his mother. He desperately craved contact with his mother. So he went from one medium to the next. They were all fakes. And for long, it really turned him against spiritualists. And he started invading their seances. So they would have their seance, and then there'd be somebody hiding inside a cabinet. He would just open the cabinet door, rip the person out. Hey, that's your ghost for you right there. And people started recognizing him. He was getting too famous, so he had assistants who would go there. They might dress up as a little old lady. They might dress up as an old man, and they would invade seances and bust them. And they were really trying to uncover something true and couldn't find anything true. And there was a popular magazine of science that issued a reward. It was like over $1,000 if they could prove that there was a real spiritualist medium. And she came out, and they put her in a big box so they can control where her hands were, and they control where her feet were and everything. And Houdini was there to witness, and they're never able to claim the prize. Nobody ever proved that they could contact the other side. And by the 1920s, that's when you start to see more laws growing up where they were banning spiritualist mediums and banning fortune tellers in different cities. And now you see that because they've eased up on these laws. So now you do see people, fortune tellers, setting up shop and things like that. But back then it was
TV shows.
A bunch of con artists.
Long Island Medium.
Yeah. Reality shows.
Now, do you think Poe would have thought Houdini was smart or a buzzkill.
Oh, he probably would have liked it because he's following the tradition of Poe's detective characters.
Sure.
So Poe's
Yeah,
detective characters are kind of tricksters too. In Thou Art the Man, he tricks the villain into confessing. That's called the psychological third degree. So that's the first instance of the psychological third degree in fiction. It's that trick Matlock, original Matlock, not Kathy Bates Matlock, but original Matlock on every single episode, he would trick the bad guy into confessing. And that's
really? That was like the whole thing.
And he does
So
it
that's
with
from Poe.
this crazy trick. He knows that the killer loves wine, so he orders a box of wine. And he knows this guy's the killer because the guy pretends to be the victim's friend and he leads the search party, but he conspicuously misses one area in his searches. So the detective says, yeah, that's obviously where the body is. So he gives him this box of wine, and the murderer opens the box, and the dead man's corpse pops up out of it, points at him and says, "You are the man, thou art the man." And the villain confesses and dies of a heart attack.
That's convenient.
It's all a trick. He'd somehow put a whale rib bone inside the corpse so it would pop up. It's sort of a spring-loaded corpse, so it would pop up out of the box as soon as you open it. And then he used ventriloquism to speak through the corpse.
Oh, you heard it first here, folks. Your next Halloween decoration time.
Yeah.
Now you know how to do it.
Kill a trick-or-treater by scaring them to death.
Oh, the kids love that stuff. When I first got to the museum, we did a puppet show based on Never Bet the Devil Over Your Head. The kids loved it. When this guy Toby, his little head gets popped off, a little blood starts shooting out. The kids wild about blood and gore. Their parents maybe not, but the buzzkills.
So we're getting close to our hour here, but you just mentioned the museum, which I actually think is a great segue.
Yeah.
For those who are more interested in learning about Poe beyond the scope of this conversation, though I would love to go on forever, where can they come and visit and take a look at some Poe stuff?
Well, the Poe Museum's right here in Richmond, Virginia, 1914 East Main Street. You can find out everything at poemuseum.org. We're the world's finest collection of Edgar Allan Poe stuff. Everything from the socks he used to wear to a lock of his hair. Even have a piece of his original coffin. When they moved his body 26 years after he died and his coffin fell apart, somebody had the forethought to grab a chunk of the coffin, and we have it on display. We've got his trunk, we've got his childhood bed. So wherever you look, there's little bits and pieces of Poe's life. His pocket watch, his penknife, manuscripts, letters. They even have a terrifying black cat named Edgar. and
what about Edgar's new little brother?
Black cat called Tib.
Yes.
Well, I live quite far from Richmond, but next time I'm making out to Virginia, I'm definitely going to make a point of coming to visit because all that sounds fascinating. And based on this conversation, he's a much more fascinating guy than I previously thought.
All right, We'll see you out here then.
Yeah. And as always, this conversation has been brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want to get some early access to our content, some behind-the-scenes stuff, and also potential book giveaways from some of the authors that we interview, go take a look at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia, and you can find the link in our show notes. We'll also have a link to the museum, so next time you're in Virginia, you can plan your trip there.
Absolutely. Beautiful city.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Chris.
Thanks so much, Chris.
It's my pleasure.
This is awesome.